The question is whether Jesus set up authoritative teachers or not. On Costa's account of what Jesus established, I'm free to reject any teacher I don't agree with. I can't be bound by any man's opinion about what Scripture means. I can only be ultimately obligated by what I think Scripture expresses. I mean, this is the foundation of Luther's remarks at the Diet of Worms, which is, unless I am convinced by Scripture and reason, I cannot and will not recant, because to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. He's making a direct appeal to the right of private judgment. So it doesn't seem that Costa's account is really biblical, which is just say I don't think the Protestant account here is biblical. Why? First, Jesus recognizes this divinely established teaching authority from Moses. He says, "You see those who sit in Moses' seat do all the things that they observe, that they tell you to observe, right? So they have legitimate teaching authority. It's just that they're hypocritical, so don't follow their example." So what's going on again is that Jesus is greater than Moses, and because Jesus is greater than Moses, and Jesus can make these kind of one-up kind of statements, it doesn't follow that Costa or any layman at the time of Christ had more authority or nullifying authority over Moses' seat. They didn't, right? And it doesn't follow now, given those statements in the New Testament, that Costa or any layman has more authority, nullifying authority over the church, right? All that follows is that Jesus could correct a subordinate authority to himself, right? That's all that follows. But big surprise, neither I nor they are Jesus. Now, the host, name is Brad, as I mentioned. It's a nice guy, seems so. He makes a straw man statement that the Orthodox view that the church is authoritative over Christ. This is actually a misrepresentation. So to get at why this is a misrepresentation, we need to clarify with some questions here. Is the United States Supreme Court authoritative over the Constitution? Well, in a sense, yes, and in another sense, no. So we have a difference here between formal and material sufficiency that this question will help tease out a little bit. So materially speaking, the Supreme Court derives its authority from the Constitution itself. Now, formally speaking, the Constitution does not interpret itself. And it doesn't interpret the laws passed by the legislature, which is why the Supreme Court was put in place to act as a check on legislative power, right? So in that schema, formally, the Supreme Court has authority over the Constitution. They have legal interpretive authority over the Constitution. They do not have material authority over the Constitution. Why? Because the Constitution materially established the court. The court did not establish itself. So we have a difference here between the matter of Scripture or its sufficiency and formal sufficiency. Protestants claim that Scripture is formally sufficient, and that means that Scripture requires no authoritative interpretation. So for Protestants, Scripture is like a bunch of bricks that contain its own blueprint, right? You just need to look at the bricks, and then you can arrange them in the appropriate way. And so the problem is, on Protestant grounds, people just aren't attentive enough. When we have 500 years of running where Baptists, Lutherans, and Presbyterians can't even agree about baptism, and they're all using the same canon of Scripture, and they're all by and large using the same manuscript tradition of Scripture, I don't think it's a problem of inattentiveness or some other epistemic blockage. Something else is going wrong. We'll get at that a little later. But this is why Protestants in part think they don't need an authoritative interpretation of Scripture, because Scripture is sufficient to interpret itself. Now, I think that this makes absolutely no sense at all. If it were the case, we wouldn't need extra biblical terms like homoousios and things like this. You would be able to come to the right doctrine just by looking at the words of Scripture. They would be sufficient, and you wouldn't need creeds and confessional statements to clarify your meaning. Um, and secondly, I'm only obligated by what I think Scripture means. I can't be obligated by, on Protestant grounds, what I don't think Scripture means. Um, so those are some of the reasons, not the only reasons, why I don't think formal sufficiency works here. So um, you have to ask yourself, was formal sufficiency operative in the Old Testament? So, for example, was why would you need authoritative interpreters of the law as established in Moses and by Moses and the successors if Scripture was formally sufficient, right? It looks like Moses was authoritative in administering the law as opposed to every Israelite. So if you want to see why formal sufficiency is, I think, not true, even on Reformed grounds, we can take the current fracas over divine simplicity in the Reformed world. So currently the Reformed world is starting to rip itself apart again over some other crisis. And this time it's on the doctrine of God, which might have some big consequences. Now, I've been watching this debate from a distance since it started about a year or so ago, and I've read Dolezal and all that other stuff. It's interesting to me because for the past 25 years or so, I've been studying the doctrine of divine simplicity. And so I'm very familiar with the literature on it. And here's the problem, though. Can Scripture formally fix the meaning of its texts so that you end up with the majority view of divine simplicity? That is, namely, Aquinas' account. And Aquinas' account has a particular feature. Even though Aquinas was not a Calvinist, most of the Reformed follow the Thomistic account or Aquinas' account. The particular feature we'll call the identity thesis. And what Aquinas envisions with respect to simplicity in part is that all the divine attributes that we think of as separate, Aquinas says that they, in God, not in our mind, but in God, they all actually denote the same thing. They're all actually one and the same thing. So love and wrath are actually the same thing in God. They don't pick out something different. But because of our cognitive limitations and are structured only for composite being, we have to think of these things as separate or distinct or different things. But in God, they're all one and the same thing. So the question then is, given the identity thesis, is Scripture formally sufficient to pick out that doctrine? I don't see how, right? That interpretation of Scripture requires that you assume certain philosophical things, certain philosophical assumptions that are by and large limited to Thomism, which would be really strange that, like, Scripture just picked out just that understanding of Catholic thought or philosophy. But be that as it may, when you read Dolezal and these other guys and they're trying to exegete this from Scripture, you have to be very attentive to what philosophical assumptions are they making. And then the question is, how are those philosophical assumptions, as opposed to other philosophical assumptions, justified? They're not justified on the basis of Scripture alone. They're justified on some other basis outside of Scripture. And then it's just a philosophical argument. So that's a reason, and that's why I think that debate is playing out, because people like James White, I think, were correct to finally figure out that you can't get the Reformed doctrine of divine simplicity from Scripture alone, not without certain philosophical assumptions. Now, White's problem is that he thinks he can read the Bible without philosophical assumptions, and that philosophy is something you build on top of Scripture, and that's just impossible. There's no philosophically neutral reading of a text, any text. I'll have more to say about James White in a separate video and that whole debate. But here, I think it's very clear that Scripture is not formally sufficient. And that's not in a small area. You may be thinking divine simplicity is like some fringe area, but it's not. It's right at the center of the doctrine of God and the Trinity and all of that stuff. So if you mess up there, it's, good night, Gracie. So Protestants have to defend not just the material sufficiency of Scripture, they have to defend the formal sufficiency of Scripture. And they also have to defend, as I said, the right of private judgment. Next up, Costa says that Scripture is their objective standard, right, to judge these things. Well, that's really not going to help, and here's why. It's really illusory. You can have an objective standard, but if you don't have a mechanism to adjudicate conflicts with any kind of, with sufficient finality, the objective standard will do no work. So you can have an objective constitution, but let's say you form a government with a constitution, but you don't have a Supreme Court. And everyone's free to judge which laws that they're going to follow and which laws they're not. Well, you have an objective standard. You have a constitution, right? That's your objective standard. But if everybody's free to interpret it whatever way they like, you're going to have chaos. You're not going to have a government. You're going to have civil war, multiple civil wars, really fast. So just claiming you have an objective standard will do no work, right? Because an objective standard doesn't give you a binding interpretation of itself. This is why Protestantism has no mechanism to formally resolve theological disputes with finality. This is why everything is all their theology is just a human construction. It's a human construction project.